Welcome to the Perinatal Wellbeing Podcast. I'm Christine, your host and certified perinatal mental health professional. This podcast is all about authentic conversations. We want to open up the discussions around perinatal health and well-being, from mood and anxiety disorders to breastfeeding to grief and loss in the perinatal period, and everything in between. While this is not therapy or medical advice, it is the place where we are going to continue to open up the discussion around all things perinatal mental, physical, emotional, and sexual health to help reduce stigma and break down these barriers to support. I acknowledge that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which Perinatal Wellbeing Ontario is located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. I am proud to acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. I acknowledge that I am a settler on these lands, and it is on these ancestral and treaty lands that I live, learn, and work. Hello, and welcome to Perinatal Wellbeing episode number 19. Today is part one of my interview with Vikki Stephenson, host of Blue Mumdays Podcast and mum to Stanley. I met Vikki on Instagram, and I recorded an episode with Vikki about my experience with parenting with ADHD on her podcast. I invited Vikki on the podcast to talk about her experience with postnatal depression and anxiety following a traumatic birth. Vikki shares her story in such an authentic and vulnerable way that I know so many people will relate to it. Vikki discusses her birth story, her symptoms of anxiety and depression, as well as post-trauma symptoms. In this episode, we do briefly mention suicidal thoughts, eating disorders, breastfeeding trauma, and childhood abuse. Take care of yourself while listening to this episode, and please reach out to myself or Vikki for support or with questions. You can find Vikki on Instagram at Blue MumDays, and mum is spelled M-U-M, and you can find her podcast, Blue Mumdays, wherever you listen to your podcast. I will put all of her information in the show notes. Hi, Vikki. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, I'm so delighted to be on it ever since I discovered your podcast. I wish so badly that I'd had something like that to listen to when I had PND. And every time I tend to listen to it on a run, and that makes me sound like an amazing athlete, and I'm not. I'm limping around the park, but yeah, I just want to scream out, yes, oh my goodness, like your episode, you did a brilliant recent episode on sort of the motherhood perfection myth and pressure, and yeah, it really resonated with me.
Thank you. Yeah. And so we connected on Instagram. You'd sent me your podcast, and then I, pressed play, and I thought, oh my gosh, how did she find me? Because you sound so professional, and like your podcast is incredible.
Not at all. That's how I feel about yours. So
love it. Love it. Let's just compliment each other all day. So you're the host of Blue Mumdays. And I'm sure the listeners can hear your gorgeous accent because you're in London. So I will put everything in the show notes, but for anyone who's looking it up, it's mum spelled M-U-M.
See what I did there?
I loved it.
Everybody loves a pun.
Yes.
I was going to call it Glum Mums, but then I thought that just rules too many people out. And
right.
I realize now as well that originally I was aiming it at sort of mothers like myself who were experiencing postnatal depression, but obviously it's incredibly gendered. And through doing my own podcast and speaking to incredible people like Elliot Ray and Mark Williams, just realized the amount of dads that are affected as well, and non-gestational mums, and you just realize it's not just the birthing mum, it's everybody can be affected. It's totally indiscriminate.
Absolutely. And even if even all the people that are around us, when we do experience postnatal depression or any type of perinatal mental illness, like it does have a big impact on the people that are supporting us around us.
Yeah. And certainly in the UK, there's now a movement towards sort of treating the family as a whole, and seeing the knock-on effect.
Yeah.
But yeah, just I hope to goodness that there is much more awareness made of, the effect it has on the non-birthing partner. It's even more, and especially for men, it's even more stigmatized and misunderstood.
Absolutely. And we could obviously have, a whole 3-hour episode just on that, right?
Yeah.
Again, I like to talk a lot about gender stereotypes on my podcast, but definitely how that impacts a male partner, right? Like someone who identifies as dad, like that's really big and far reaching. Definitely.
Yeah.
And so can you tell us what inspired you or prompted you to start your podcast?
Well, the big event in my life was that I had my son Stanley in 2012. So it was just around about the time of the London Olympics. So, well, it was actually the summer of sport. I remember I think there was a World Cup or Euros on, and yeah, it just seemed to be like one big sporting event after the other.
Yep.
And we even still have this tiny little baby grey. He had like the first baby grey he ever wore, and it's got like the London Olympic symbols on.
Lovely.
But yeah, I had my much loved son, but developed severe postnatal depression. And I just remember how utterly alone I felt and isolated. And I was shocked that as a white, fairly middle class, fairly privileged woman in London in 2012, how little information and support was available to me. And I thought, God, if I'm struggling, what about people in rural Wales or Scotland? What if English wasn't my first language? If I'm struggling, it's, God knows how other people get supported. And I found there was a real lack of empathy and a real lack of understanding from health visitors. I was desperate to meet other mums going through the same experience, because it seemed like everybody around me was having, this golden time and not struggling in the way that I was. And so I was incredibly lucky. I was able to access Liz Wise's P&D support group, Cedar House, and that was a lifeline to me. And so for years, I've wanted to sort of give back to other women going through that experience. And I was coming to the end of a 21-year career at the BBC and had been interviewed for a couple of different podcasts about my career. And I just suddenly had an epiphany that maybe this is the way to sort of reach out to other parents and make them feel like, you're not alone, that you're not always going to feel like this, and to offer them some recovery stories and expert opinion. So it offers them a bit of hope, really. And I suppose, I just remember how alone and utterly bleak I felt in the middle of the night, when it's dark and you're awake with your baby at 4 a.m, struggling to breastfeed, struggling to cope, and all these dark thoughts are coming. And, I had insomnia. And so podcasts became a lifeline to me when I couldn't sleep. So with that, and then the increasing isolation of parents with the first COVID lockdown, just made me think that podcasting was the perfect way to reach people when they need it, and because they can, tune in at any time. So whether they're walking the streets or lying in bed awake at night, they can. Sorry, that was a very long-winded response, but yes, that's how Blue Mumdays started.
That's amazing. And it's so interesting because our stories are so similar. I feel like I was probably in my son's room at 4 a.m. In Canada at the same time that you were in London in the UK, with your son in the middle of the night, because my son was born in May of 2012. And so absolutely that isolation. And you feel like, I don't know, it just felt like I am so alone.
Yeah.
And because it's late at night, everyone else is sleeping, you're trying to nurse, and then I put him down and then I'd pump, and I was like, why?
Oh God, the pumping,
Ugh,
just the worst.
the worst.
The worst.
So
You know, the thought of the sound of that medulla machine just makes me feel sick.
absolutely. My chest is tight right now thinking about it,
Yeah.
right? Absolutely. So,
Apparently you can get ones that now, like literally you can just have them underneath your jumper and they're working away and you can just, carry on doing other stuff rather than being like
attached to that
attached
big
to this
machine.
machine.
Right. Oh, well, that's good, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I still have a bit of an aversion to pumps, so it's hard for me to think that that would be a good thing
just
anyway.
yeah just yeah I know we had different sort of breastfeeding stories, but yeah, the anxiety is
Absolutely.
very real for me
Absolutely.
still, and it's 8 years since I breastfed,
Right.
so
Right. Absolutely. It stays with us, right? And so when did you first notice any symptoms of PND or, whatever you were experiencing? When did you first notice those symptoms?
um well, I'd always been worried that I was going to get PND because my mum had very severe postnatal depression with myself and my brother, and I knew that she'd had that. I didn't have a huge amount of detail, but I do know that she had horrific births, especially with my brother, and that she had what I now know is birth trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder because of that. And she would have flashbacks and nightmares. And so I had the fear in me about giving birth, like I knew that, I felt very anxious around it. So I was worried that I had the susceptibility. I'd also had my own experiences of sort of depression and anxiety, but it had never been really formally diagnosed. But I had an eating disorder when I was probably, yeah, I'd say from about 13 to 25. And it's something that I've only just started talking about because I did an episode of Blue MumDays with Hope Virgo, who's the most incredible campaigner for people with eating disorders. And we talked very much about sort of navigating pregnancy with an eating disorder, because that's another sort of world of issues and emotions. But yeah, so it was kind of like the evidence was there, but I thought if I don't admit any of this publicly to anybody, it'll just go away. so
Yeah.
so I don't think I ever mentioned it when I had like midwife meetings. And I don't know about your experience in Canada, but certainly over here it's very unusual to have the same midwife, so you're just seeing different people all the time.
Right. Okay.
And so I never really had that conversation. And I thought by doing sort of hypnobirthing, that would give me a sense of, a feeling of sort of control and preparedness for the birth, rather than this like terrible fear of, what my mum went through. So yeah, I had the occasional wobble during my pregnancy, but nothing bad. I loved being pregnant. I was very, very fortunate. I had a great pregnancy, and apart from a bit of sciatica, when I went from like marching upstairs to suddenly limping and becoming like the traditional waddling
Yes.
waddling pregnant mum,
Yes.
which I was determined not to be.
Yes.
Yeah, I waddled, believe me, I waddled. I would say it's when, yeah, it was during and after the birth. I mean, I changed irrevocably. I don't even know if that's the right use of irrevocable, but yeah, I changed something. It's like something snapped in me. And I told them afterwards, I said, I do not feel right. I feel like a zombie. I do not feel right. What I realize now is I had birth trauma. And I can now own that as birth trauma, having spoken to Dr. Rebecca Moore of Make Birth Better, because for a long time I beat myself up for being traumatized by my birth because I didn't have severe medical intervention. Stanley's life wasn't at risk. Yes, he had his the cord around his neck, but that was very quickly dealt with. I wasn't at medical risk, so I felt I didn't have a right to be traumatized. But I subsequently realized that birth trauma can sort of present itself in so many different ways, and a big part of that is not being validated and how you're treated when you're at your most vulnerable. I can see you nodding furiously. I can tell this is resonating.
Oh, Vikki, yes, because that's what I see on the side of like in my therapy work with my clients is the theme for every client that I've had with birth trauma was they were not validated. They were not supported by the staff, the medical staff around them. They weren't even acknowledged, even like during birth, labor and delivery, there was a lot of stories of not being given information, not being updated on what was going on, if there were issues, stories of like the nurse coming in, checking vitals, monitors, and then just walking out, but not speaking to
Oh my gosh,
the birthing
yes.
person, right? And so I'm nodding furiously because it's just come up so much, in how I support people and hearing those stories. And what is I find upsetting is that there's a lot of trauma that we could actually minimize.
Yeah.
Just asking people like, how are you?
Yes.
Are you okay? Or like, how was that experience for you?
And the language used. And, another thing that I've learned through doing the podcast is the systemic racism, certainly within the British healthcare system, and how sort of Black and ethnic minority mums are treated, which is even worse. And there's so many expectations put on them about their behavior that, oh, you can handle the pain because you're Black. Your pain isn't as bad because you're Black. That if you try and assert yourself, you're seen as aggressive and difficult. And that labeling is so damaging. And I just think if there's one thing, I keep thinking about how can I help in terms of helping health visitors and midwives and the medical staff to be aware of how important language is. And I hope that there's some way I can use my lived experience to help encourage change, because it is so damaging. And there's a big part of me that sort of grieves the early years of Stanley's life and the experience that I wished I'd had with him. I mean, for anybody that's going through it right now, I think it's really important to say to you that whatever you're going through will not affect how you grow up with your child. So for Stan, I was very lucky. I didn't have a bonding issue with him. I bonded with him immediately. That's not to say I did not have a rush of love. I felt nothing. I just felt numb when he was handed to me. And that is not to put down anybody that does have that, because it's something that you don't control. And, I can't think how difficult that is. But having spoken to people on the podcast and through my own experience, it doesn't damage your child and scar them forever, which is what I kept being told.
Yes.
That you will damage your child forever, you will scar them for life, by crying in front of them. Or so when I finally told Stanley that I was doing this podcast, and so I'd explained to him about mums with postnatal depression or parents with postnatal depression. And then at one point I actually said to him, did you know that I had postnatal depression? And he's like, no. And I said, how did that make you feel? And he said, well, surprised, because you're always so joyful. And that, my God, I started blubbing as soon as he said that.
I'm sure.
But as far as he was concerned,
I
represented happiness and love and warmth, and he didn't see the bad stuff. And I think there's so much guilt put on parents, and yes, the 1001 days, the first couple of years of a child's life is incredibly critical. But I think, having spoken to Liz Wise, who's the most incredible P&D counsellor, and, the lady that saved my life and the lives of countless other women, she came on as my first guest. And I really wanted to interview her daughter, Emma, because Liz had terrible problems bonding with Emma. And Emma came and talked so eloquently about how she loved her mum. She was a better mum for having had PND, because the atmosphere that Emma was brought up in was about being encouraged to talk about your feelings, and it was okay to not be okay. And funnily enough, that's the one constant that I'm getting through doing the podcast and speaking to people with lived experience, is how they don't actually regret having had that experience, because they feel they're a better person, they're more compassionate, they're more empathetic, and actually a better parent because of it. So I can't even remember what the original question was. I've gone off on a big tangent.
It's so true. And I loved that episode, and listening to Emma speak and speak about her mom and, the bond that they have, and how, how she perceived her mom, of what she went through, how her mom coped. And of course, how her mom has gone on to support so many people.
Thousands of women,
which is incredible.
And it's not just, and this is the thing you have to remember, and it's like yourself when you're doing your practice, it's not just helping the individual, it's helping the family as a whole.
Absolutely.
And that's the thing you have to remember, that the children, the partners, the friends of. And one of the great things that Liz did as part of her support group was that she had an evening for in the case of my group, it was for the dads, to help them sort of try and understand what we were going through, because there is so much ignorance, and unless you've actually been through depression or experienced any mental health issues, it's very hard for you to empathize and understand what that feels like, because it is so irrational compared to a rational, emotionally well person. And it's really hard to explain how dark and desperate you feel.
Absolutely. So that's amazing, because that is so important, to be able to get our partners, on board, and to understand what we're going through. And I'm wondering too, like you said about not, we're not damaging our kids and those things, and it's a real fear. But what I say to my clients is same for myself, right? Is that now you can be aware of your symptoms. For some people, we know it's really just that time limited in that postpartum period. Once they recover, they might not ever experience symptoms again in their life, which is great. And for some of us, that's not the case. And so I still take medication. I still have anxiety and depression. And
same here.
Yeah,
same here.
Absolutely.
It's like we are literally kindred spirits. Yes. My goodness.
Yes, absolutely. And so, because of that experience, I'm much more aware of my symptoms and how to take care of myself. I'm not saying I do it very well all the time. But that's the thing with clients too, and people I talk to is, well, now you're aware, you can tell when you're not feeling your best, or you're not feeling well, you're having a low day, or you can feel that anxiety coming in. Now you're aware of it. Right. Which that's how we can take care of it.
Yeah. And I think it's a really important point to make, that recovery isn't linear. It's not like an upwards trajectory where you're consistently getting stronger and stronger. And that was actually very comforting when Liz explained in the support group I was in, that actually it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and about how you can oscillate wildly. Because I remember when I first started going to the group, and I felt absolutely, I would never have taken my own life, but I didn't want to live. I wanted to run away. I wanted to escape that horrible feeling and feeling of being trapped. And And that's not to say, I love my family best, desperately, and I still do. But I had this feeling that they would be better off without me, that they didn't need me, that I wasn't good enough for them. And, all those sorts of nonsense thoughts that the illness can dredge up. And to have somebody say to me that actually, if you have a few good days and then a bad day, you're not defined by that bad day, you're still making progress. And within a few weeks, I felt so good. I thought, I don't need to be at this group anymore. I'll be here to help cheerlead the other people in my group, but I'm fine. And then within another 2 weeks, I would be like desperate. So, it's, I just want to say to people, it's, unfortunately, it's not one of these things you can say within 5 months, you'll be over it. But what I can say is that you will have good days that will gradually outweigh the bad days. And you'll get to a point where you stop counting the good and bad days because you're just on a roll. And, I don't know at what point postnatal depression becomes just normal anxiety,
right,
and depression. And I had a great chat with Dr. Andy Mayers, who's a really big mental health awareness campaigner in the maternal mental health field. And he was saying the big difference between postnatal depression and normal depression is the level of guilt felt by the mum or by the birthing partner or by the dad.
Yep.
And that, who knows? But I'm still affected at times, and I'm still on my antidepressants, and I'm okay with that now. I desperately tried to come off them. I had a major wobble sort of about 6 months after my dad died, and I just realized if it's given me something that my body is lacking, and it's making me feel normal and able to cope with challenges, it doesn't stop life being difficult. It doesn't stop things affecting you, but you are able to overcome those challenges and not be weighed down or devastated by them.
And you're able to access the coping skills that you have.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
That's what I say, because that's how it felt for me, that once I started the medication, it was like the fog lifted. And then I was able to implement what my therapist had been talking about for 6 months. that I wasn't able to connect to previously. So the medication was so helpful. And then I was able to also use the skills that I needed. And even now, if I'm not using those skills, then I'm not feeling well. Right. So even though I'm still medicated, I can still not feel well. Right. So it's like important to kind of take that holistic approach of like putting everything together that makes you feel.
Yeah. And I don't know how you felt taking medication, but I was really scared of taking antidepressants. I don't know what I thought they would be. And I remember like my GP at the time saying, don't make a big deal out of it. Just literally take it and just don't overthink, because I was clearly in her room overthinking, catastrophizing, all or nothing thinking, all the classics. And I thought, I was really worried that it was going to make me sort of take away my personality, or it was going to make me numb, so not able to feel anything. Or make me artificially happy when I shouldn't be happy. So then when I came off it, I would always be addicted to them. And it doesn't do, well, so, I was very lucky in that my the first medication I tried was successful. It was a good fit for me, but it's so hard for anybody going on antidepressants or trying medication, because they say normally, the first 3 to 4 weeks, it can be worse before it gets better. And to say that when somebody's in the depths of despair and real, heightened panic, that's forever. It's
can't last 3 to 4 weeks.
Or like if you say, there's a 6-month waiting list for CBT, that's you can't even see beyond the end of the week.
Yes.
And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to do my podcast every Monday. So because I remember feeling how alone I felt on a Monday when my husband had gone back to work, and I would have the whole week stretching out ahead of me, and I would just feel the fear and the sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach on a Monday morning. So I kind of wanted to offer people something sort of hopefully reassuring to listen to, if they felt that too.
Honestly, Vikki, I feel like our stories just so similar. Because when I was evaluated, and then of course, she recommended medication. I was like, no, I'm not taking medication. And I think definitely those, all those stereotypes and that misinformation that's out there, that, medication is going to change you and change your personality and make you a zombie. And if that happens, that means it's not the right medication for you, right? It means that the dose is correct, or you need to try a different type of medication. Not that that's how you're supposed to be, right? And I know that now, and I can tell people that now, but the other side of it was that if I take medication, I'm admitting that there's something wrong with me. Even though I was in the depths of despair and I knew something was wrong with me, but it was just like this admission of being broken.
Yeah.
And so I resisted medication for 6 months. And that, I don't regret things in life, but that I wish, because I suffered for no reason, like just for these reasons in my head that made sense at the time, but that were not based on reality. So that for me is like still a sticking point in my story. But same thing when I first started therapy, it's like, okay, how long is this going to take? Can you tell me like how many sessions I need to do? And then I will be like better. I will be here. I will be the best patient you've ever seen. And then I will be better and I can go home,
I can walk out, head up high.
Yes. And it didn't work like that. And like you said, I think too, it was kind of like this high of like, I got help. I advocated for myself. I'm in touch with someone. They validated me. Like, yes, this is a thing. You have a diagnosis. This is what's going on. So I was on a bit of a high. And so I think it was like the first or second session with the therapist, I said, I don't think I need to be here. Like, I'm fine. And she was like, okay, like, let's just see what happens, And then, like you said, 2 weeks later, I'm like bawling for an hour in the office and like not coping, not managing at all. I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'm not better.
Yeah.
But it is common because when I have new clients, they always ask me, how long is this going to take? Every time. It's so interesting. And I'm like, I can so empathize because I ask the same question.
Yeah. You want a sort of like, if it's going to take a year, it'll take a year. But I want this line where it's not affecting my life anymore.
Yes.
And I don't know about you, but I really felt as well that taking medication meant that I was a failure. That I was failing at P&D as well as, failing at being a mom, failing at this, that somehow it's like, no, I can do this on my own.
Yes.
But then when they're explained to you and it's about sort of like, well, maybe your body's lacking a chemical. And if you're diabetic, you take insulin. So this is no different. And
there's still so much stigma about that, right? Again, people all the time will say to me, like, I don't need medication. I'm not a doctor, so I don't prescribe or anything. But, sometimes I broach the subject of like, this is what can be helpful with medication. What do you think? But usually it's when they get to that point of total desperation. And then they're like, I'm going to call my doctor and ask about medication, right? Which is, again, hurts my heart a bit. Like, why do we have to get to that point of desperation?
Yeah, it's something that Liz talked about very eloquently to me, and about how in her experience, because she, she's seen thousands of women through the Cedar House support group, and she feels that in most cases medication is helpful. And that's not to say she advocates or condones any which way, but she has seen how it can be transformative in terms of helping women feel better.
So back to your story. So you mentioned that you were able to feel and express in hospital, I don't feel right. Something doesn't feel right. What was the response that you got?
You're just tired, just very dismissed.
Right.
So with my birth story, basically my waters broke 3 weeks early, and I was told that if I didn't go into natural labour, I would be induced because of the chance of infection. I knew that I desperately didn't want to be induced because I knew it could be a more painful birth, and my mum had been induced and I was terrified by her story of being induced. And so I was delighted when my natural contractions started overnight, and we were told to come into the hospital the next morning, which we shouldn't have, and my contractions stopped. And apparently that's a very common thing, that you get tense as soon as you get near the hospital.
Yes.
And they stopped, and then I was sent back again, and it's like, okay, we'll come back at 7 o'clock at night, and if they haven't restarted, we'll induce you. Well, luckily they did restart. Everything was great. I had my little TENS machine. I had all these things. So I've been listening religiously to my hypnobirthing CD, and I even had like a little fan and lavender oil, so that I was gonna have like beautiful lavender. Yeah. I was a geriatric mom in that I was 40, and so I was deemed as high risk. So, the thought of having like a water birth or anything like that just wasn't open to me. But I thought, I'm going to try and make it as holistic, and yeah, for some reason I sort of really fell into that. I don't want any medication. I want to do it all by myself and be as pure and natural as possible, which is a narrative that kind of gets pushed on women, that it's entirely natural, so therefore you have to feel every moment of agony without anything to help you.
Yes.
And basically, long story short, I had an app on my iPhone. So you pressed a little button every time you got a contraction. And I'd registered 40 contractions, and they were beginning to get more intense. And I remember, telling them, and then they sort of hooked me up to something. And then they said, oh, you haven't had any contractions yet. And I was like, no, I have. I've been in quite a lot of pain. I've just been managing it well. And she very dismissively said, no, you've just had a bit of back pain. And I was in a lot of pain by that point, which I've been managing really, really well. And I went from being excited and positive to the rug being pulled and suddenly panicking, thinking, well, my God, if this isn't even contractions, then God help me.
What am I going to do?
Yeah.
Can I ask you, did a feeling of, can I trust myself? Did that come in? Because she's like doubting you and telling you that's not contractions. Like, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. I think that, my God, yeah, you've just hit the nail on the head, because I think that was the first thing that I'm just having like a real moment, because and this is a long-standing feeling that I have since then, of not trusting my own judgment. My judgment doesn't matter. It's not good judgment, therefore. And I think you've
Sorry, Vikki.
I get really emotional, but I think you have literally just opened my eyes to that. Just feeling like that I can't cope with the pain, that I'm really weak and pathetic and stupid. So they induced me, and it wasn't something that I felt I could question, because you're and like with my husband, you trust the medical profession, that they know best, and we know nothing. So, but yeah, so long story short, we'd put in my notes, that we didn't want to be disturbed much, and be as natural as possible, with as little intervention as possible. But they had a particularly busy night on the ward with loads and loads of inductions anyway. So, and my memories are now sort of very few and far between. But what I do remember is we were just left. We were just left. And I could hear like the screams of other women sort of from rooms, down the corridor. And I just felt so devastated that, yeah, it was like overnight, or just in that moment and those words, that all hope was lost. And so eventually somebody came back, and I was in a lot of pain by then, and I was saying, oh, can I have something? And they said, oh, here's some pethidine, this will help you to sleep. Didn't even touch the surface. There was definitely no sleeping going on, and I think my husband did fall asleep at one point, and I practically punched him awake. I was like, how dare you?
I would have too.
Yeah. And long story short, I remember just being utterly traumatized. My body was convulsing and shaking, and I have a memory of being on the floor and my body just convulsing, and being terrified, absolutely terrified. And when they finally came, they sort of said, oh, we'll leave you for 6 hours and see if you started dilating. By the time they came back, I was actually, what I didn't realize was I was pushing, and that basically I had progressed so far. So it's one of these things that I still wish I'd had a birth debrief to sort of fully understand what happened. But when the midwife came back, they were in shock, because they were like, holy cow,
right.
This woman's going to have a baby right now.
Yeah.
And again, I was forced to go on the bed and on my back, which is not what I wanted. And I didn't realize that you could insist how you birth. It was very much told, like, you've got to get on your back.
This is
right. I'm
practice.
gonna, yeah, just literally. And I felt like a passenger in my own birth. Just, there was no empathy. I mean, a very nice male midwife came, because they sort of changed over, and he was a lot more human and caring. But at the same time, when my son was born, and yes, I did get skin to skin when he was first born, but he insisted on that I had to be stitched up. So I had a episiotomy and tears, and he would not let me breastfeed in that time. So I didn't get to breastfeed my son for an hour. And I kept saying, I want to breastfeed, and being told, no, I'm sewing you up first. Now, why that couldn't have happened at the same time, I really don't understand. And I think that also helped, or didn't help, in terms of hormones and ease of breastfeeding and that sense of being listened to. It was very much, yeah. And
how it's done.
I think
you have to do it this way.
Yeah,
right?
but it sort of was that kind of almost like teacher,
Yes,
child, parent, child. And I had a very let's say emotionally abusive father, so it sort of played out all those things of, like, I had to listen to authority, and my thoughts and feelings didn't matter. So I think, that's not to blame the medical staff in any way, because I was bringing, all this baggage to it anyway. But yeah, I think the nadir was going for a shower, being told I had to take a shower, and I just felt utterly in shock. And they weren't listening to me when I said, no, I do not feel right, I don't feel right. And I just stood in the shower, and I don't know how long I was there, but it was like the water was just pouring over me, and I was feeling nothing. and then being aware of time passing and that I had to sort of get back. And I think in that time, I don't know how long I was in the shower for, but some water had been like running into the corridor, and obviously not great. And I got a massive bollocking for that.
Wow.
I was really told off. And so again, I don't think that helped in terms of my emotional
Absolutely.
Resilience
Right.
at a time when you're so vulnerable when you're giving birth.
So vulnerable. I think it's, apart from perhaps like assault or something like that, but like giving birth is the most vulnerable I've ever been, because in that moment you can't go into fight or flight because you're
Mm,
in labor, right? You can't run,
no.
if you felt like you needed to, like that option is not there, right? And so that's really scary. And, I want to just hold space for the fact that, yes, you brought your history into the room because that's your story. And I think the system failed you because the system is not trauma informed, right? And if the system as a whole, same as in Canada, if the system was trauma informed, we would be more aware. Nurses, midwives, OBGYNs would be more aware of these are possibilities that if I speak in this way to someone, for example, like, it's okay, shh, good girl, it's okay, those types of things can be extremely triggering for anyone that's experienced any type of abuse, sexual assault. Those sayings and things that they use to like get us to do something they want us to do. Not being told, I didn't know either. I gave birth to 3 kids. I didn't know until I came into this field a few years ago that I could have said no to certain procedures, that I didn't have to consent to every single thing.
Yeah.
I didn't know
Yeah.
that that was possible, and I was lucky I had, good labor and deliveries. But for those people that don't, it just hurts me. It hurts my heart, and
Yeah.
it's,
That's,
I just want to hold space for that, Vikki, that that's not your fault. And that does lead to trauma. It's not about, that textbook definition of trauma of like being in a war or in a car crash or being assaulted. It's if we feel we can't cope in the moment with whatever's happening to us, that can lead to trauma, right? And that birth trauma can happen for someone who's had a surgical delivery or who's pushed for 5 minutes and had a short delivery or whatever that looks like. Any one of us can experience birth trauma depending on how we feel, how we're supported or not supported. All those things factor into it.
yeah. And I think that the one thing that I'd like to sort of say to people listening to this, if they are pregnant and, whether they've already had a child, I think it's really important that if you have a birthing partner, whoever it is, whether it's a friend or, your actual partner, I think it's so important to have an advocate for you who represents your voice and make sure your voice or your needs or your wishes get heard. Because, I had the most incredible chat with AG Silver, and they are an incredible doula and set up the Queer Birth Club in the UK. And just the way they were talking, and I really wished so badly that I'd had a doula, because I think my birth experience would have been so different. And I think what an incredible job that they do.
Absolutely. And we've seen statistics now that are being shared that having a doula can, reduce the risk of medical interventions, excessive interventions, C-section deliveries, all those things. Because yes, you have that person there that can kind of translate, the medical speak, so, so to speak, and also advocate for you, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
advocate for your partner because again, your partner loves you if they're your partner, right? Even if it's a family member, parent or sibling, they love you. And so seeing you in pain is like really difficult, right?
Yeah.
But for a doula who, of course, they care for you, but it's not that same emotional attachment, they can still like stay in that place of being able to advocate for you. And, I think it's important to talk about that on the birth plan of like, how do I advocate for myself while I can? And then when I cross that line where like maybe I can't talk anymore, or I'm just really trying to stay in the zone, or I'm like in a lot of pain, how does my partner or doula or support person, how do they advocate for me? How do they see the signs in me? Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially if they're a partner, like like when I look like I'm in distress or that something is not right, being able to see that in me and then advocate for me. I think it's important to have those conversations.
Yeah, and gosh, my husband's fantastic, and he was absolutely fantastic at the birth. But it's when those things happen, and you are very much raised that the medical staff know best, and so it felt like we couldn't question them. But one thing that was mentioned to me, sort of not long after, is to really flag that on your notes, and we thought we had, that I was doing hypnobirthing, because hypnobirthing mums don't tend to talk about the pain,
Right.
or they're able to manage the pain better. And so apparently this is something that does sometimes happen with mums that have practiced hypnobirthing, that they kind of don't, that
Not verbalizing it.
because they're not verbalizing the pain, that it's therefore
Not that
just
bad.
assumed you're not. I mean, it's so weird, isn't it? But it's funny enough, just having this conversation with you brings up all these things about, why as women do we, it's like all these weird badges of honor that we're expected to, because I remember very strongly the feeling of like, you must not have any medical intervention, oh, well, I managed to birth without any gas and air even, and that sort of real badge of honor, and that badge of honor of like, oh, I was able to breastfeed beautifully, I've never had to give a bottle to my child. And all these expectations, that are kind of foisted upon us by society, and that we sort of foist on ourselves and each other, and the judgment. And so I think no wonder we feel bloody guilty.
Absolutely. And the impact of all of that in the moment, right? And like how we manage our pain, how we maybe deny ourselves pain management when we feel like, oh gosh, this is really sore. This really hurts, right? You know, I- you don't get a medal. No one, like society doesn't give you a medal for birthing without medication or, even gas and air or an epidural, right? And I was like, I really want to birth without an epidural, but I'll just like go with the flow, see what happens. Thank God I took the epidural. I was so happy. And for me, it sped up my labor because then my body was more relaxed. So then I dilated faster, and then I had it for each one. But for each one, it wasn't as strong. So I felt much more. And for the last one, I got it. And then I delivered him not long after. So I felt everything anyway, but it was fine. Like, at least I knew like that's what I chose, right, in the moment. And again, like there was no delivery, there was no medal for like, oh, I felt the most pain with the third one.
What's that about?
Yeah.
That's such bullshit.
Yes, it is. Like there's no medal. Like there's just, stretch marks.
Yeah, and also this it's a very personal thing. But I've had friends who felt very badly that they had emergency C-sections, that they hadn't given birth properly because it wasn't a vaginal birth. And it doesn't matter how you have your baby, as long as they come out sort of happy and healthy. And
That's still a delivery. Like you still
oh my God,
brought that
yes.
child into the world. And I think that word natural is a big problem,
Yeah.
right? Like natural delivery, like that means no interventions, no nothing, and vaginally, of course. But like, I just think it just brings all those, stereotypes and guilt trips with it, for sure.
I've actually just in having this conversation with you, I've just had like two other, funnily enough, memories from the birth that I've never really thought about until now. And one was that I was given gas and air, and I was told that I wasn't doing it right. And so I had this message of, because I was like, really struggling to breathe, and I'm a severe asthmatic anyway. And so I was really struggling to breathe with the gas and air, and being told you're not doing it right, you're doing it wrong. And then when I was pushing, being told, I was like sort of pushing and then being told, don't push unless you get a contraction or something like that, and realizing like, oh my goodness, I've been doing it anyway. And then that feeling like I've been doing that wrong. And I just actually think with you saying about not being
yourself.
Yeah. And then it's no wonder I've spent the last 10 years doubting every single decision I make. And I went from being a really capable person to being somebody incapable of deciding what clothes to put my son in, in the morning, because I was worried about every eventuality. Will he be too cold? Will he be too hot? Will that be scratchy? Will that, and you just become this shell of a human being when you used to be fairly intelligent and able to do stuff.
Confident. Yes. And that like anxious part coming in and saying, well, if you put the wrong clothes on him, like what was the fear for you? If I don't dress him appropriately, what's going to happen?
That something terrible would happen. I don't, it was never like a
definitive.
And I just remember, I was speaking to a mum friend the other day, and they were reminding me about when our babies were weaning. And they said, I just remember you one time when we went to a baby group and you saw like another mum with like a pot of blueberries, and you became obsessed with this pot of blueberries that, you kept saying, I had never even thought, it had never occurred to me to give Stanley blueberries as like a weaning finger food. And just this, like, it doesn't matter, but it was almost like I'm not a good mum because I hadn't thought about giving him blueberries. I mean, it's, ridiculous now. I can laugh about it, but
in the moment you become fixated on that thought, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And for me, it was because I had my two kids before my third, which is when I experienced my postpartum anxiety and depression. But before that, I was confident as a parent, like I'm going to make mistakes, but it's okay. Like I'll figure it out. And I know that I'm the best mom for my boys. I was so confident in that. Never, of course, again, like making mistakes and like, totally making loads of mistakes, but thinking, okay, my partner and I, like, we're doing this together. We can figure it out together. We've never had babies before. We're just learning. Right. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Until I had postpartum anxiety, and it like made me think you can't trust yourself. You don't know what you're doing. You're not a good mom, because I did believe that I wasn't a good mom. I wasn't a good partner. I couldn't nurse my baby, like all the things. And so that's when doubt came in for me. And I agree. It has stuck around and it's still there. And it's a work. I have to work really hard to challenge that voice. But definitely that came in for me, which was like definitely night and day. Something that's so concrete that I could notice that, shit, I don't trust myself.
Yeah. And I still struggle with, and funny enough, my career at the BBC was all about creativity, and I struggled so badly sort of in that environment after having the PND, because everything was based on your judgment. Everything was based on your ideas, were they good ideas? And also you were scrutinized on everything you did. So you were judged on a daily basis on your ideas. And I just found I couldn't thrive in that environment. And yeah, the stress of that really got to me, because yeah, I couldn't trust myself. And there's even days when I still defer to Matt sometimes about it's like, should Stan have sun cream on today, because I didn't I just couldn't trust myself to make that judgment call. And I still remember, like, I don't know if you ever experienced this, but on a regular occasion I would like go into Boots or a pharmacy, and I'd start putting stuff in my basket for like baby things, for like the sterilizing bottles, or for Infocol and all these different things that you get for your baby, teething granules. And then I would just suddenly have a panic and a feeling that I needed to get out. And so I'd just have to drop the basket, get the buggy, and like literally leg it out of there. And it would just be this awful feeling. And I actually realized that I still have this feeling at about 4:00 in the afternoon. And this is like 9.5 years old. My son's nearly 10. And it relates to, because I had problems breastfeeding, but I had an oversupply issue. And also because Stanley was so little, he was on the, do you have percentiles in Canada?
Yes, that's another podcast episode, Vikki, but yes, we do.
Right. Yeah. You know what I'm talking about. They just, even the thought of the red book makes me want to vomit. And basically Stan was born, he was 37 weeks +1. If he'd been born like 2 days earlier, he would have been classed as premature, and he would have had his percentiles adjusted. So he was a really small baby. He was 5 pounds 11, and he's a really small child. Now I'm not a big person. My husband's not big. My mother-in-law and my mum are like little tiny Ewoks. They're just, we're not a tall family. And Stan was I think he was on the second bottom percentile, and dropped to 0.4, which is the lowest one. And I was put under so much pressure about, he's not big enough, you need to feed him. Anyway, long story short, I remember having, again, I think it's this thing about not being trusting my own judgment, and being sort of told that I had to be at home to breastfeed him more, that I needed to feed him more, because I've been told by one health visitor, no, you don't need to wake him up all the time to feed. And then the other one was like, no, you should be waking him up because he's too small, and you should be feeding 2 hours all through the night, all through the day. And it's this feeling of that I had to be at home to breastfeed. And it goes back to walking through the park. I can still see exactly where I was in the park, and that feeling like, oh my God, it's 4:00. I need to be at home breastfeeding. Because at the time I didn't feel comfortable breastfeeding in public. And I still, to this point, get a physical feeling of nausea and extreme anxiety at about that time of the day, especially if I'm out of the house. And what is that about? It's so weird.
So from my perspective, I would think that is a trauma response. That is because you're having that visceral physical reaction. Your body is interpreting something's wrong, right? Like, for example, 4:00, I need to get home and feed him because he's underweight. He needs to be fed. Like, this is urgent.
It's my fault. He's so small.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right. And so that, without getting like too therapist-y, kind of like that trauma wound, being still there, right? Where we get that visceral physical reaction. That's how we know it's like a trauma symptom versus a memory, right? Or a flashback versus a memory, because of a memory, we can just think back, oh, that was a really terrible time. That was really difficult. I remember that. And now I'm here in the present moment. I'm safe. I'm good. We're happy. Stanley's happy. We're all good.
Yeah.
Whereas that flashback or that trauma response is like, I feel like I'm there and the panic comes in, or that visceral physical reaction of fear or whatever comes in, right? I have to get home, panic. That we know is more of that trauma response.
This is brilliant. I mean, this is like a 3 hours therapy. It's amazing. But no, now that totally makes sense when you put it like that.
Mm-hmm.
That totally makes sense. And the I'd say the trauma from the birth and also the breastfeeding trauma, I think for me were like the two biggest inputs into or triggers for my postnatal depression, I think, without a doubt.
As you heard, I related so much to Vikki's story as mine was very similar. I was so honored that Vikki shared her story with me and all of you in such a real way. Vikki has taken her story and used it as a catalyst to start her podcast and share information with people about perinatal mood and anxiety disorders and so many important topics that impact our perinatal wellness. There is power in sharing our stories, and I know that Vikki's story and podcast will continue to help so many out there who are currently struggling with any perinatal mood or anxiety disorder. Next week, which is the season finale of our first season, you will hear part 2 of Vikki's story with postnatal depression and anxiety. Don't forget to check out Vikki's amazing podcast, Blue Mumdays, wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please share this podcast with any of your friends or family members who may benefit from it. If you feel you are experiencing any of the symptoms or issues that we discussed today, please reach out to any one of your supports. You can also go to perinatalwellbeing.ca for more information, blog posts, and podcast episodes. Check out our new episode every Wednesday.